At noon today, I sent a message to the Congress about the situation in Korea. We have sent land, sea, and air forces to assist in these operations. We have done this because we know that what is at stake here is nothing less than our national security and the peace of the world.
With those words, President Harry Truman informed the American public that the United States would join the United Nations effort in Korea to stop the communist aggression. We're really glad to be here for our program today, History in the First Person, the Korean War. We're going to have the chance to talk to two individuals who served America's military during that period of time, and I want to introduce them to you now. We'll start right here immediately to my left. Minnie. Claire, thanks so much for being with us today.
Thank you for having me, Tim.
It might be a bit of a surprise to folks to find out that I'm sitting here next to a woman, and that woman was part of the Korean War effort. Give the students just a little bit of information, Claire. You were a woman's reservist at the time?
I was a woman reservist. The Marine Corps was the only unit that had reservists at the time, and there were only a few hundred of us who were who had enough training by July of 1950, and when the men were called, they had the women attached in platoons. They didn't know what to do with us.
But they ended up doing something with you.
Yes,
we're going to talk about during
did.
the program.
Yes,
Thanks for being here, Claire.
Thank you.
And to her left is Woody Powell. Woody, thanks so much for joining us today.
Thank you for having me.
Give the students a little bit of information. What is the time frame you served in Korea?
I served in Korea from October 52 to July 27, 53. July 27 is a significant date because that was the date they signed the truce.
So that's the date the actual ceasefire took effect.
Right.
We're going to have a chance to learn more about what happened during the war, and of course for you guys to ask your questions throughout the program to both Claire and Woody. As always, we're being joined by Interactive Schools video conference. We'll get to them in just a little bit, but don't forget, if you're watching on the web or television, then you can email us your questions to live@hectv.org. That's live@hectv.org. To begin with, we want to give it a little bit of context of the time, so to speak. The war begins in July of 1950. It ends in July of 1953. But let's begin by talking about life in America post-World War II and just what it was like in those late 40s, early 50s. So Claire, you were obviously, in high school when World War II was happening?
I graduated between VE and VJ Day.
Okay.
I was 18.
And just in case our audience doesn't know, VE Day would be in May of 1945, and VJ Day would be in August of 1945.
Yes,
so
I graduated in June.
What was it like? The war was over.
Yes.
Were we just all ecstatic? Was it like, my gosh, what was the? We'd lived through rations and that kind of thing. What was it? Give the students a comparison a little bit about war versus post-war.
You're right. It was the end of rations. We looked forward to different way of eating. We didn't have to worry about the meat stamps, and we even had could get the shoes we wanted. We didn't have to wait until we had a ration stamp for that. And the men were coming back. They were settling. A lot of them had married during the war. A lot were getting married. The housing was, it was hard to get a place to stay because there were so many more married people and they wanted to be on their own. But usually it was a great feeling. It was, everybody went back to what they had wanted to do. The war plants started making refrigerators and cars again, and we didn't have to put up with the old things that we kept tied together. So it was a great time. It really was.
Now, Woody, for you, are you in high school, junior high? How old are you when World War II's over?
I was 14.
Okay.
And I turned 18 in 1950 when the war started, and I graduated high school that year.
And so what do you remember? Were you in St. Louis at the time or living elsewhere?
No, I lived in Berkeley, California.
Ah.
Yeah, I graduated from Berkeley High. We had moved to Berkeley in 1941, and my father was a physicist and had worked on the atomic bomb with Lawrence and Oppenheimer and those people. And I remember World War II was the time of gathering paper and grease and foil and all that stuff, and war bonds and war stamps and running on bald tires, and no roast beef, and oleomargarine.
Yeah, butter was not available.
Right.
Do you remember at the time at all, Woody, about like being worried about communists and the whole communist scare thing?
No, that wasn't on my radar screen. I was interested in the country. In 1948, I had run away from a school in Pennsylvania and hitchhiked across the country. And I fell in love with the United States of America. So the next year, I hitchhiked back across the United States. And so I was just kind of immersing myself in the opportunities that were coming along. You know, funny little things go through my head when I think about that time, like 1947 Studebakers, which were the most advanced thing you ever saw. You couldn't tell which way they were going, you know, that type of thing. And in 1950, when I graduated high school, I took off hitchhiking again. I wound up in a magazine selling crew. I picked them up in Santa Monica, and I wound up even with my expenses in St. Paul, Minnesota, and was hitchhiking back to California when the war broke out. And as far as joining the service, I hadn't thought of that because I was disappointed that World War II was over before I could get into it. I was very much, you know, taken up with all of the activity of that war and the jingoism and the heroism and all that stuff, and I wanted my opportunity to serve, and it was over until the Korean War came along, and then I joined.
Well, let's start to talk about the Korean War. That's a perfect thing. To talk a little bit, give you some history information about the situation in Korea and what was occurring. We're going to begin by looking at a map of the region of Korea. So you see Korea there, North and South Korea. You see China. You see Japan. Obviously, Japan was still under United States and military command forces post-World War II. Korea had been split North and South, Communist Korea in the North, Democratic Korea in the South. China, of course, a large communist country. Mao Zedong and the Chinese communists had taken over. So we're dealing with the late 1940s, early 1950s. There's some real concerns in this area of the world, at least from a lot of politicians, that there was a significant threat about communism and what were those communists going to do and how would they be moving into different things. And the president, of course, at that point in time was Harry S. Truman, obviously from the state of Missouri, Independence, Missouri, my old hometown, Independence, Missouri. Harry S. Truman, our 33rd president of the United States. So he's our leader at this point in time from America's perspective, and our military commander in the Pacific at this point in time is General Douglas MacArthur. And you see General Douglas MacArthur there, who is actually one of the few five-star generals in the American military. There may be a little bit more conversation we'll have later in the program about Truman and MacArthur and what they did or didn't like about each other. But we're talking about a period of time where MacArthur has a great deal of influence over everything that's happening in the Pacific as the commander of forces there. And that's the world that exists. This threat of communism, this concern, when the North Korean forces in 1950 invade across what's known as the 38th parallel, which gives you again Korea, and you see the 38th parallel, that longitude line, North Korea, where Pyongyang is located, the capital of North Korea, Seoul, the capital of South Korea, and a couple of other important locations which we'll be talking about as we talk about the war, both Incheon and Busan. And when the communists began to move down into the Korean peninsula, they were very successful at the beginning of the war. They crossed the 38th parallel, they went far into South Korea, and it was just basically the southeastern corner of South Korea, the area just around Busan, that remained in South Korean forces. So by the time UN forces are going to get there in late summer, early fall of 1950, they're already behind the eight ball, so to speak. A lot of land had been taken from them, and there's significant concern about how they were going to get a beachhead in Korea and begin to move forward. So a little bit of that contextual information takes us back to Claire now. You, at this point in time, are in the women reservists when war breaks out?
Right. In 1945, when the war was over, most of the women went back to civilian life. But in 1949, the Marine Corps decided that instead of opening a boot camp as such, they would start a women reserves, and they were to have platoons of 50 women attached to each battalion in bigger cities. Well, they didn't get to 50, but and not all of us had enough training, but about 23 of us from St. Louis had enough training, so when the boys left by troop train one day, we went to Union Station and left in a Pullman car that night for California.
Now, what got you interested in the reserves to start with?
I wanted to be in the military when I was in high school, but the war was over by the time I graduated. So when the opportunity came to be both in the service, reserves, and also have my if I needed to staying home, I joined the reserves.
Very good. And these, of course, the images you're seeing are clear back in the 1950s, that early period of time. And what was the training like? What did you do? Did you have a boot camp experience in the same way that Woody would have had a boot camp experience?
No, not at all. I'm almost ashamed to say. We went to our training one night a week, as the boys did, and when the boys went off to boot camp for 2 weeks, they didn't have any place set up for us, so we went into the reserve center for 2 weeks for training, and I learned the military orders and how to drill. But of course, we were having that one night a week anyway, but it was concentrated then, as if we were in boot camp.
So it's 1950, you're already in the reservists, you're just graduating from high school, traveling the country a little bit. Did you get drafted into the military, or did you volunteer, Woody?
I volunteered. I wanted to join the Marines, but they turned me down because I had an injury to my hip from football. And so I went to another center in San Francisco, and I worked a little thing on the doctors as I was going through there, and I managed to get through that particular physical exam and found myself in the Air Force, and for a 4-year hitch.
And what were you going to do? What was your plan in the Air Force? Did you have a particular?
I did not have a plan. I got on a train, and then I got on another train, and then I wound up in Lackland. I was there for 2 weeks, and up to Shepherd for our training, and they were not prepared for us. There was a tremendous influx of draftees and so forth at that time, and they were opening up old barracks and so forth. So we spent a lot of time cleaning up barracks and so forth in our basic training. Went through basic training, and then they decided that they would give me a job doing the thing I was least qualified for, and that is become a policeman. They made an air policeman out of me, and our training for that was done down in Tyndall Field, Florida, where we just played war games, running in and out, and trying to blow up fake airplanes and things like that. And a little bit of advanced infantry training and some judo training, and then they turned us loose.
Let's give you a little bit more historic information before we then go to more student questions. 1950, it's September of 1950, and what we've got to be able to do is figure out how to get into Korea so that we can go beyond that southeastern corner where Busan is, and the decision is made to try to do a beachhead assault at Incheon. The newsreel footage you'll see now and throughout the program is actual footage of the time, so let's give you a little bit of idea of what it was like to land at Incheon, September 1950.
On September 15, 1950, the UN forces take the offensive. An assault fleet appears off Walmy Island at Incheon Harbor, 150 miles behind enemy lines. It's a daring end-run maneuver which takes the sleeping enemy completely by surprise. At 0630 hours, the Marines begin the assault. The naval barrage has cleared the way for them, but this is still a risky operation. Headquarters must gamble on the first try being good. Incheon's violent 30-foot tides leave no time for a second attempt.
We had orders to neutralize resistance and do it fast. Dig them out and cover up the holes. It took us 58 minutes to secure the island.
With the next tide, more Marines move into the streets of Incheon itself. They meet little resistance, and within hours the city is secure. The big gamble has paid off. With the surrender of Incheon's modern harbor, the back door to Seoul is open wide.
The end of that narration is extremely important because Incheon provides the opportunity to get to Seoul. What they needed to be able to do was to find some sort of way to retake the South Korean capital of Seoul and to begin to create some sort of like pincer movement where they could come from the north as well as from the south and try to get those communists in the middle of South Korea, but then also be able to cross the 38th parallel, go across into what is now the demilitarized zone, but up into North Korea and actually begin to push the communists back. That was obviously their goal. So Incheon became extremely important and enabled to a large extent the opportunity for Woody to serve then, because if we had failed at Incheon, who knows what might have happened in terms of the ability to do other things in Korea. Let's see what student questions there are. Buria Middle School, unmute your microphone. Do you have a question right now?
How did your family and friends feel after serving in the Korean War?
That's a great question. So, Claire, what did your friends and family think about you joining the military?
They weren't really happy. My dad wasn't especially happy to have his daughter in the military until he met my friends and found out that they were just as ordinary, I guess you could say, as I was, and just as interested in the military. My dad was a World War I veteran, so they accepted us as we showed them what we were in there for.
And Woody?
Well, I'm not sure about my parents. I don't think they were very happy. I wasn't living at home at the time, so I wasn't at all sure. But I remember my schoolmates thought I was stupid. They were going on to college, and I was joining the military, and they thought I was really missing an opportunity.
Thanks for the question, Buria. We'll come back to you throughout the program. Sterling School, let's go to you in South Carolina. A question?
How did the Korean civilians react to your presence in their country?
Oh, thank you for that question. I'll let you mute again. Woody, talk about that, the Korean civilians.
Korean civilians. Well, it was very difficult to tell exactly what they thought of us because we were not very popular. They had to work for us, and I just remember being very, very cautious about any relationships with them. I remember there was a lot of pilferage from the bases, there was a lot of sabotage, there was a lot of guerrilla activity where I was, and you couldn't tell what people who worked on the base during the daytime, what they were doing at night, infiltrating and trying to take us out. So I don't think we were terribly popular throughout most of the portion of South Korea that I saw.
And let's bring that map up again with the 38th parallel. We'll go back to that image again. Where were you located? When you get to Korea, you're in a place called Daegu?
I'm about between Seoul and Busan, about halfway.
All right, so you're basically there in the middle of the country.
K2, yeah.
Okay. And maybe we should talk a little bit too about the physical conditions, because we've had a couple of email questions that have come to that regard as well. Again, one from Salmon River about the conditions you experienced, the physical conditions, what kind of places you lived in, tents or whatever on the operating base, and the winter conditions, obviously, at that period of time. We got some newsreel footage of winter conditions in Korea. Talk a little bit about the physical nature of being there. Was it lots of mud? Was it lots of cold? What was it like as we look at this video?
Okay, when I got there, it was winter. And it was very, very cold. We were first put up in these old Japanese barracks that were stuccoed, and most of the stucco was gone, so the wind would come through the cracks. And we were on canvas bunks. We were given one blanket. And I made the mistake of putting the blanket over me, where I should have put it between me and that canvas. And I just practically froze to death. We had these stoves that put out a furious amount of heat, about 5 feet, and then it was cold from that point on. And I remember going to sleep with my boots on and then waking up and breaking out ice from between my toes.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. So it was very cold, and we didn't have proper cold weather gear. We were given a lot of secondhand stuff. I had a Powell jacket that was one size too small. I had a great long knitted scarf that I got from the Red Cross. Wrapped that around me, and a Powell cap, and then just long johns, fatigues, and jump boots. And you know, if I put too many socks in my jump boots, then it was too tight, and that was cold. So I was constantly on the move, you know, and I couldn't stand still.
You couldn't win for losing, so to speak.
I couldn't win for losing, and I remember there was a warehouse that had flight jackets, these very nice warm things that the pilots wore, you know, and I remember we stole one from there, and whenever one guy got the coldest post, we would pass this jacket on. So that's how we dealt with the cold.
And let the students know what it is you were doing by the time you actually got there.
By the time I got there, I was in a canine unit.
A canine unit?
And it was the first one ever used in this particular way to provide air-based defense. And it was all night duty. We were given 800-yard areas to cover with a man and a dog and a .45 caliber pistol and a whole bunch of ammunition and a radio that sometimes worked. And
the emphasis on sometimes.
Right. And the ammunition was old and it sometimes worked. But we were pretty effective. The Koreans were afraid of the dogs, and we were able to spot a lot of guerrilla activity before it actually came down to the borders of the base and headed off. And we walked a different post every night. Oftentimes we took sniper fire in the early hours of the morning before we were picked up, usually, when they could see us. And it was fairly nervous duty, but it certainly wasn't hot and heavy combat.
We're going to have a chance to look at some hot and heavy combat in a bit, but that's an interesting contrast for the students to understand. Let's go back to Ohio. Lake Catholic, another question from you.
Do present-day movies show a realistic view of what war was like?
Comparisons between present day and then in terms of like
war.
Mm-hmm.
Very similar.
Just a moment. As you speak to this, let's run the newsreel footage of some infantry action in Korea. We'll go to video segment 9 so the students can see some historic footage of the kind of warfare there. Woody, while you speak.
Well, some of that warfare that you're seeing now is all-out combat where you're moving lines up against an enemy and taking fire and giving fire. That is not what is typical now. What's typical now is patrols. What's typical now is more like what we were doing with the canine unit, really, working in the dark, going up against the unknown, and feeling our way around, and in a very hostile environment where you can't tell friend from foe. My heart goes out to these people that served in Iraq and are serving in Afghanistan now, where they can't tell the friend from foe, and it's just heartbreaking when you wind up killing somebody that you don't want to kill.
That goes along with a question. We've just gotten a couple of email questions from Salmon River. Thanks very much. Don't forget, it's live at hectv.org if you've got a question. And they're talking about communications with the civilians. Did you worry at times whether or not the people around you were on your side or another side? Absolutely. And how did you communicate with them?
Well, yes, we worried. And sometimes we just took a hostile stance and ran them off. And it got very complicated because our government, I think, made a huge mistake and cozied up to an organization called the National Police, which was a creature of the Japanese occupation. They were very, very corrupt, and I remember we were tasked with posting them on the perimeter, and then we put our dogs out beyond the perimeter, and those guys would shoot at us at night to make us take cover to allow people in. So we had a very distrustful relationship, okay? And they were very brutal. I witnessed torture and I participated in it to some extent. I thought I was doing a good thing because instead of beating up on people that we captured, I used my dog to just terrify them into giving us the information that we wanted, but I'm not happy about that. I'm somewhat ashamed of my role in that, and ashamed of the fact that I witnessed an awful lot of that stuff without doing very much about it. But that's just the way things were at that time.
Well, thanks for that information. We'll continue to talk about that. I want to go up to Wisconsin. St. Croix Falls, a question?
We were wondering, when you guys were stationed over in Korea, if you guys were stationed and got to serve with World War II veterans, and if you did they kind of like take you under their wing and kind of show you the ropes of wartime strategy and kind of what to do and stuff like that?
Woody?
Very definitely. My first soldier, man named Parker, Master Sergeant, he was a combat veteran from World War II. He'd served in Europe in the airborne. My first soldier back in the States was a China Marine from World War II. My captain in Korea, Captain Marlette, I'll never forget him. He came up through the ranks during World War II, and he had battlefield commissions. I remember when the war ended in Korea, he was put in charge of security at Panmunjom, and eventually took a permanent rank as a warrant officer, because he was not comfortable in officer country. And he and I actually took sociology classes together at a University of California Extension during the war.
Wow, okay, that's an interesting little sidebar.
Yeah,
That's
it was. Yeah.
Now, Claire, did you serve with women who were like WACs or WAVES during the World War II?
I was at the Marine Depot of Supplies at San Francisco, so it was all men and women. Actually, when we got to San Francisco, we took over the desks of men who had already left, who were already in the war zone. But the few women from the World War II were our NCOs, because we got to be PFCs before we went, and there were sergeants and corporals who were our NCOs out there, and they did help us very much. They kept us on the right track.
Great question, St. Croix Falls. Thanks very much. Let's go back to South Carolina. Buria, your next question.
For you, what was the most difficult part of serving in the Korean War?
You might have a lot to choose from, Woody, but I'll start with you on this. The most difficult part of serving in the Korean War for you?
Children.
Children.
There were an awful lot of children that were orphaned and just wandering around and starving and dying and freezing to death. I remember coming across a couple of little boys in a little shack alongside the river, frozen in each other's arms. And we did what we could in our unit, the K-9 unit, to feed them, give them tasks to do to earn money, not money, but food and building materials. And eventually, you asked, there was a previous question about a relationship with people. Mm-hmm. I developed a relationship with a young boy when I was at that National Police headquarters. He was kind of a gopher boy that was there. And I was there one night on liaison duty, and they brought in an old woman who'd been caught stealing from the base, and this police lieutenant, who I had come to hate, started beating up on her. I stopped that, and the boys saw that, and there was an old man in there, an old papasan with that little gauze hat that they wore. And the boy was also chewing gum very loudly. This is crazy. He was chewing gum, and very loudly. So I had first stopped the beating up of that woman, and I caused her release, which really pissed off the lieutenant, and that's just too bad about him. And then I took the boy to task for chewing so loudly. Well, the boy went and talked to the old man, then went out, came back in with an egg. Now, eggs were just extremely valuable then. And he presented this fresh egg to me. And he said in English, because he apparently got the words from the old man, "You are a gentleman." And I thought, oh my God, and what am I going to do with this egg? Well, I accepted the egg, of course, and then I had a thought, and I punched a hole in one end of it, sucked out the contents with great apparent relish, and then drew a face of him on it with a ballpoint pen and handed him the shell back. Well, that little boy eventually led me to a farming couple who were taking in kids that were wandering around, and they were having a great deal of difficulty, and they didn't have enough clothing for the children. They were putting them up on a pallet in a basement that was under a foot of water. And I remember writing back to Berkeley a letter that got published in the local newspaper asking for clothing for the children. And my brother, who was working as, my younger brother, he was working as an assistant manager at a movie theater there. He had a wonderful idea, and he held a Saturday afternoon matinee performance, and the price of admission was clothing for the Korean kids, which had been publicized in the newspaper. And it was hugely successful. And I got a call from my commanding officer, Captain Marlette, saying, "Woody, come on down here, we got a real problem." We had this little APO, and this huge mound of boxes outside the APO that wouldn't fit in it. And he let me requisition a Jeep and a trailer, and my buddy Scotty laid himself over this teetering pile of boxes, and we carried it out to the farming couple. And we started distributing clothing. Turned out a lot of it wasn't suitable for children, and I was initially very disappointed. But that same boy said, hey, this is wonderful. So we got all this adult clothing. We had furs and fedora hats and overcoats and shoes, and we took it into town and got building supplies and bags of rice on the black market, and were able to start this construction of a dormitory there. And it eventually became an honest-to-gosh orphanage that got official recognition. I was able to get some more funding for it through the chaplaincy.
What a wonderful story.
Yeah, well, the best part of it is, for me personally, is I was a very, very angry and confused and disturbed young man because of all this distrust and the hate that I felt around me, and the humanity that was demonstrated by that couple brought me back to my humanity, introduced me back to myself, if you will.
You actually wrote a poem about that.
Yeah.
Would you take the moment to share that with the students?
Sure. Yeah, The Gift of the Children. They were two boys, embracing death together, frozen in each other's arms. I saw this and knew how it could happen in this war of mine, where children were torn from fathers and mothers, brothers and sisters lost to each other, and men and women in uniform were separated, at least temporarily, from their good natures. These boys were killed not by bombs and bullets, but by unreasoning hate. Yet, what was there to hate in those small bodies ground down by the massive neglect of armies devoted to war? Then a boy I had come to know took me by the hand and led me to a small farm, where the old farmer and his wife, though very poor, gathered in every child that passed their door. They gave shelter, a little food from their scant stores, and the gift of life in the midst of death. What was there to hate in that act of love? I saw this too, and could not hate any more.
Thanks, Woody. And thanks for that question from South Carolina. Let's go back to Sterling School in South Carolina. A question from you?
What was the hardest thing to do or accomplish when you were in Korea?
The hardest thing was getting over my revealed capacity to hate.
Claire, we've had an email question come from actually another woman named Claire. How did you feel part of the war effort being back in San Francisco? Were you all aware? Were you watching the news constantly? I should say reading the newspaper, not necessarily watching it on television, but were you aware of events, and how did you feel as part of the effort there?
We were very aware of the events because we almost felt a little guilty taking over the desks of the people who had gone on, but we were told that if they hadn't had as many people there, they would have had a lesser chance of surviving. So every day we would get reports from what was happening. We were first line, you could say, as much as you could be and still be in this United States. So we just kept up on everything. And another thing was when the men came back from the Chosun Reservoir, they came back to San Francisco. And of course, they looked up the people they'd known at the depot, and we were, of course, with them. And they didn't talk a lot about it, but when they talked among themselves, we got an idea of how rough it was at the Chosun Reservoir. So.
Thanks, Claire. Let's go to more student questions. We'll go back up to Ohio. Lake Catholic High School, a question?
When you enlisted, what were you expecting?
Oh, so when you joined the military, what were you expecting? Was the reality shockingly different, Woody, from what the expectation?
Oh, about 3 months in, I wanted out. But yeah, I thought I was going to get over to Korea, get my opportunity to be a hero, and then come home and bask in that. That I was very untutored. What happened in reality is I wound up spending 20 months on a little radar outfit in the middle of the Mojave Desert, which wasn't all bad. I learned to love the Mojave Desert, and eventually when I got married and had children, I took them back there and we used to camp and had a lot of fun in that Mojave Desert. But when I first encountered it, I thought it was, the armpit of something,
Understandably.
Yeah.
St. Croix Falls up in Wisconsin, a question from you again?
We were wondering if you had to re-enlist for the Korean War and kind of do it all over again, would you think twice about it, or would you still go back right into the war and enlist?
Well, if we were face to face, I'd ask you the question, what do you think? But yeah, I would think twice about it. For one thing, I know a heck of a lot more about the origins of that war than I did then. I know a heck of a lot more about the conduct of the war than I did then. I've had opportunity to go back since and see some of the sites where atrocities were performed. I've been to Nogunri, I've been to Kokonri. I was the only GI to show up at Kokonri and apologize to a woman who lost 80 people in this little family shrine to some very panicky GIs in the early stages of that war. That war, in my opinion, just my opinion now, did not have to happen. I think there were a lot of mistakes made in our foreign policy at that time.
Claire, as you look at that question that the students in St. Croix Falls just asked, would you do it again, join the military?
Yes, definitely, because I had a couple of years after high school when I had wished that I had been able to join during World War II. So yes, sir, I would.
You were in San Francisco,
yes.
And we want to run some newsreel footage now of the end of the war, the ceasefire that occurs. And San Francisco was a place where a lot of the troops came back to, and then let's start to talk about that transition for both of you from war back into peacetime.
A ceasefire had ended armed hostilities that had begun as a test of the free world's firm stand on communist aggression whenever and wherever it occurred on the face of the earth. The troops that just a few hours before had been clawing at each other in dead earnestness now joined in this moment of relieved celebration. Peace had come to Korea. And now came the moment that the loved ones and friends at home anxiously awaited. The repatriation of prisoners of war by both sides. The communist forces had played a brutal game of cat and mouse with their daily reports of the names of Americans in their POW camps. Now the truth would be known. Beginning on August 5th, 1953, a seemingly endless parade of prisoners from both sides began. The released South Korean soldiers didn't have far to travel to reach the welcoming arms of their loved ones. Scenes of unbridled joy like this were commonplace in the streets of Seoul. All told, some 12,670 United Nations prisoners were repatriated by the communist forces. Not all of them could make it under their own power. Some were dazed and shocked, evidence of the communist brainwashing technique. Of the more than 75,000 communist soldiers released in the trade, the vast majority still harbored bitter hatred of the UN forces in their breasts. As a mark of disdain, a scene of the Panmunjom exchange area, they shed their lone prisoners' uniforms even as they were carried on stretchers. The first Americans home were the wounded and the ill. Flown to the United States, they managed sweet smiles and waves to the family and friends waiting anxiously to shower them with affection and relieved embraces. The others arrived by boat at San Francisco, a happy bunch of warriors. Some veterans of World War II as well. They had risked their lives for a cause whose basic issues were at best muddled and unclear. But it was a battle that had to be waged, and they knew they were the lucky ones. Over 33,000 of their buddies were left behind in simple graves on the Korean countryside. The police action was at an end. The living could rejoice.
Claire, you were in San Francisco.
Yes,
Troops
sir.
are returning. What was that like?
I left San Francisco before the actual end of the war, but the ones who returned, they weren't in really good shape. So it was kind of when you sit with a sick relative, you just relate to them that way. But you try to cheer them up and do normal things with them, go to the show with them or whatever, so that they can kind of get back into the life here, even if they're not civilians.
Woody, that part of the newsreel footage speaks to both, prisoners of war on both sides, Chinese soldiers as well. And since the war has ended, and many years later in the 1980s, you actually went to China and met someone who served on the Chinese side in the war, correct?
That's right.
Talk a little bit about that in the book that's resulted.
Okay, Zhou Mingfu is a man, he's 2 years older than I am. He and I were brought up during World War II, he in China and myself in the U.S. Very different experiences. He knew GIs in China. His sister-in-law ran a grog shop with her husband in Chongqing, and he knew GIs that served there, and then he was conscripted to go into Korea. He knew English because he'd been taught by an American missionary. And in 1949, and this always shamed him, he stood by while his missionary mentor was carried off by the communists. And he felt like Peter at the time that he disavowed his knowledge of Christ. And he told me this years later. Anyway, he and I met in China in 1983. I was traveling with a bunch of railroaders. And we became friends. We had a long correspondence. I sent him books because he was teaching. He was a teacher. And I invited him and his wife to come to this country, spend some time with us. And it was quite a process to get him here. He and his wife came, and we just had a fantastic time. And he wanted to write the story of his life. So we sat down in front of my old K-Pro computer, and he would dictate the story of his life to me, and I would transcribe it.
And eventually,
and this became this book.
To Walk the Golden Road became this book.
Yeah.
That's a phenomenal story to me in terms of so many years later you met someone who fought on the other side.
And he, because of his ability with English, worked with American prisoners of war over there. And that's in the book. And the treatment of American prisoners of war by the Chinese was quite different than the treatment that they received at the hands of the North Koreans. The Chinese were very honorable and did what they could to make life as easy for them as they could. It was the North Koreans that were so brutal.
Okay. Thanks you for sharing that. I want to go to Berea Middle School for what may be the last interactive question we have time for, but don't forget everybody, email them to us at live@hectv.org and we'll send you email answers after the program. Berea, let's go back to your question about the memory of the time. Go for it.
What is your best memory from your time of service in the Korean War?
I thought we'd speak to this at the end. Your best memory from your time of service in the Korean War. Woody, and then we'll go to Claire.
The best memory was receiving all those boxes of clothing and all that led to. That was my absolute best memory.
And Claire, for you?
The camaraderie of the Corps and the people I worked with, that was the best.
Thanks so much for being. It's great to spend time with you again, Claire. It was a couple of years ago we had the chance to do a show previously. And Woody, so nice to meet you. Thank you so much. To everybody who joined us interactively, thank you for your participation. And thanks to everybody at the USO for hosting us here today. Bye, everybody.